All right, let's dive right in. Today we're diving deep into the soil of Mughal India, because that's where the real story is. We're going to uncover the massive, complex world of agrarian society that was, no joke, the true engine of the entire empire. And just to give you a sense of scale, get a load of this number: 85%. In the 16th and 17th centuries, a staggering 85% of the Indian population lived in villages. Think about that. This wasn't just part of the Mughal Empire. For most people, it was the Mughal Empire. So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the big picture, how this whole empire was basically built on farms. Then, we'll zoom right into daily life on the land. After that, we'll explore the village community, the incredible power of the local elites, and the state's massive revenue machine. And finally, we'll ask, how do we even know all this? Okay, let's set the stage. If you want to understand rural Mughal society, you really have to understand the relationships between three key groups of people. You had the peasants doing the actual work, the powerful local elites called zamindars, and of course, the Mughal state itself, watching over everything. So what was their relationship like? Well, it was a mix of everything, all at once. Sometimes they cooperated because, they had to, but they were also constantly competing for a bigger piece of the pie. And yeah, that often boiled over into outright conflict. This constant push and pull over what the land produced, that was what powered the entire empire.
Right, let's get down to the absolute foundation of this whole system, the individual peasant farmer. Who were these people, and what was their day-to-day life actually like?
Well, for starters, there were two main types. You had the Khud Kashta. These were the local guys, residents farming their own land in their own village. But then you had the Pahai Kashta. These were non-resident farmers who would travel, sometimes pretty far, to farm land in other villages. This tells us that peasants weren't just stuck in one place. They were making savvy economic moves, looking for better tax deals or escaping a bad harvest. And check this out. This quote from the very first Mughal emperor, Babur, just nails it. He was amazed at how mobile everyone was. He saw that entire villages could basically pack up and move, setting up shop somewhere else almost overnight. This wasn't a static world. It was incredibly fluid. Now, it's really easy to picture peasant life as this constant, grim struggle just for survival, right? Just growing enough food to feed your family. But was that the whole story? No, not even close. And that brings us to this really important idea called Jinsi Kamil. It literally means perfect crops. And this wasn't some bottom-up movement. The Mughal state itself was pushing peasants to grow these high-value cash crops. Why? Simple. They brought in way more tax revenue. And we're talking about really valuable stuff here. Things like cotton, sugarcane, oilseeds, even lentils. These weren't just little garden patches. They were grown on a massive scale. It shows that subsistence farming and commercial farming weren't two different things. They were happening on the very same plots of land. Okay, so we've met the individual peasant. Now let's zoom out a little and look at the social world they lived in, the village community. So at the very heart of the village, you had the panchayat. You can think of it as an assembly of the village elders. And let's be clear, this was basically an oligarchy, a group of the most powerful men whose status was often inherited, and their decisions, they were the law of the land in that village. And the person who ran the panchayat was the headman, or mukaddam. This guy was the crucial link. He was the one who dealt with the state, who supervised the village accounts, and who basically made sure everyone stayed in line. Now, it's tempting to get a bit romantic about this setup. Years later, some British officials called these villages little republics, imagining them as these perfect, equal communities. But the reality? Oh man, it was so much harsher. This was a deeply divided society, sliced up by caste. Menial and laboring groups were often pushed to the absolute fringes, locked out of power and stuck in poverty. All right, time to climb the social ladder. Let's talk about the zamindars, these incredibly powerful landed elites who stood right between the peasants and the Mughal state. So where did they get all this power? Well, it came from three main sources. First, they had their own huge tracts of private land called milkiyat. Second, the state gave them the right to collect taxes from the peasants, and they got a cut for their troubles. And third, and this is a big one, they had their own private armies, complete with forts, cavalry, and foot soldiers. And we are not talking about a few guys with sticks here. That military power was immense. According to the state's own records in the INA Akbari, the combined infantry of all the zamindars was over 4.2 million men. That's not just a local militia, that's a serious military force that the state absolutely had to take into account. So, were these guys villains or heroes? Well, that's the tricky part. They were kind of both. On one hand, they were definitely an exploiting class, living off the hard labor of others. But on the other hand, they could also act like patrons, giving out loans, setting up local markets, and, get this, sometimes they even led peasant revolts against the state if they felt the taxes were too high. It's complicated. Which brings us perfectly to the very top of the pyramid, the Mughal state itself. How did this massive organization manage this whole agrarian world? And more importantly, how did it get its money? Well, they had a pretty sophisticated system, and it worked in two main steps. First was the assessment, or jama. This is where officials would come in, do detailed surveys, and figure out exactly how much tax was owed. Then came the second step, collection, or hustle. This is when the state actually collected the revenue, and here's the key part. They almost always wanted it in cold, hard cash. So you might be asking yourself, wait, a cash economy on this scale back then? Where did all the coins come from? And the answer is pretty mind-blowing. It was global. A massive flood of silver, mined in the Americas, was making its way through Europe and into Asia to pay for Indian goods. This silver influx is what allowed the Mughals to mint tons of coins, turning the rural economy into a cash-based system. It's what made the whole thing work. So, we have this unbelievably detailed picture of how Mughal society worked, from the peasant's field all the way up to the emperor's treasury. But how in the world do we know all this stuff? It all comes down to one absolutely extraordinary document. Our main source is a book called the Aini Akbari. It was put together in 1598 by Akbar's court historian, Abul Fazl. And this thing isn't your typical history book about kings and battles. No, it's a massive, detailed breakdown of how the empire was run, a huge collection of imperial rules, tax rates, and statistics about every corner of the empire. Honestly, without it, our understanding would be just a fraction of what it is. But, and this is the really crucial thing to leave you with, the annal is, at the end of the day, a view from the top looking down. It's the official story, told from the court's perspective. It gives us the structure, the numbers, the rules, but it leaves us with this huge lingering question. What about the other side of the story? What was life really like for that 85%? What stories of their daily struggles, their joys, their acts of resistance are missing from the official record? That's something to think about.